Welcome to another episode of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by the Kleimer app, a clear way to learn Chumash Rashi. The app contains the text of each pasuk with Rashi Menuked and a shir by Shalom Menachem Wohlgelenter explaining each word of Rashi. The app is easy and simple to use, contains bookmark capability and a daily calendar, and is free to download. You can find the link in the show notes, or you can find it on the App Store. To sponsor an episode of the podcast or to support the podcast in any way, you can email me, sfarimchatter@gmail.com, or you can find a link and information in the show notes. You can also find a link in the show notes to subscribe to the Sfarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Sfarim, book deals, and more, as well as a link to the Sfarim Chatter status if you prefer it that way. Finally, if you can please subscribe to the podcast, whatever it is that you listen, and if you can rate and review the podcast as well. And with that, enjoy this episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Jordan Katz, who is assistant professor in the Department of Judaic and Near Eastern Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And we will be discussing her newly published book, which is titled Delivering Knowledge, Jewish Midwives and Hidden Healing in Early Modern Europe, published by Stanford University Press. And it's about Jewish midwives. So thank you, Professor Katz, for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. So, I grew up in New Orleans, and I didn't tell you that before. And I studied at Columbia University as an undergraduate. I did my graduate training at Columbia also, so I was there for a very long time with a little break in between undergraduate and graduate school. I lived in New York for many years, and now I'm a professor at UMass Amherst in the Department of Judaic and Near Eastern Studies, as you said. I'm a historian in that department, and I live with my family in the greater Boston area. So that's a little about me.
This book focuses, as we'll get into, in the early modern period or pre-modern or whatever you want to term it nowadays, and how that field specifically is something that you're interested in exploring, specifically this book about midwives. But how did you become interested in that time period, Jewish history?
I was always interested in history. As a high school student, I mean, I really credit my high school history teacher with sort of just broadly kind of opening my eyes to seeing that the study of history wasn't just, facts and figures, but really he sort of opened my eyes to seeing that, this is really thinking about like how we understand what happened in the past and how we interpret it and make sense of it. And then in college, so first of all, I studied in a seminary for a year in between high school and college, really immersed myself in rabbinic texts. So I was always very interested in that. In college, I kind of tried to avoid becoming a history major. I tried everything else to say like, okay, I'm going to try to see what else I'm interested in. But I kept on coming back to history. And I took a class with a professor named Matthew Jones, who was at Columbia then, now at Princeton. And he taught a class called European Renaissance. And he was such a captivating lecturer. And I just loved this period. I just loved the stories that he told. And then I took a class, I think after that, with Elisheva Karlebach, who had just started there at the time, who would later become my dissertation advisor. And I just was always interested in Jewish texts. And so it really kind of spoke to me. And because I had in college, a background in French and Hebrew. My French and my Hebrew were pretty good. So I wanted to write a senior thesis project as a sort of experiment. And because I had, I fell in love with the sort of European Renaissance class and then also with Professor Karlebach's class. And I settled on something that would kind of focus on French Jewish history in this early modern period. And I ended up writing something about aspects of Jewish communal autonomy in Metz, which is in Lorraine, in northeastern France, using sources in both French and Hebrew to try to sort of like, utilize the languages that I could bring to the table at the time. And then after college, I floated around to a couple things. I worked as a legal assistant for a little bit. That was not my favorite thing in the world for various reasons. I lived in India for a bit. And then I worked on, I was sort of working simultaneously, as a research assistant for a couple of professors, transcribing sources and editing some of their transcriptions of different manuscripts. And then that's how I sort of got facility with reading some of the handwriting from some of the Ashkenazic cursive from this period. And then, I eventually decided that this was something I really wanted to pursue and apply to PhD programs. So it was sort of, I think I love the period that I study. I think it was sort of a story of having these great instructors who sort of guided me towards, convinced me that this period was interesting.
I want to say also, well, I'm looking here to find my first email that I wrote to you. So the first email was in September of 2022. I'll give a shout out to Michelle Margolis, who pushed me and really said, you have to do this podcast. This is great. She did her PhD. I don't know if you finished your PhD at the time or you were finishing it, however it was.
Yeah, I'd finished it.
Okay, they said it's a great topic. You should do it. I emailed you and you're like, okay, let's do this in a few years when the book is out. So fast forward a few months ago, I saw the book was coming out and I emailed you. I said, well, we got to do this. So now we're finally here. Okay, so let's define also, and this comes up because but before we started recording, you asked me, am I only interested in early modern period? Well, no, but to a large degree, I am very interested in that period. So I've talked about this on other episodes, but I think for the sake of this discussion, we should clarify, what does early modern period mean and what period are we going to be discussing? What do the Jewish communities look like in this period and for the conversation here in this episode?
Different historians will sort of put different chronological bookends on the period, but for my purposes, I think about it sort of as, broadly speaking, 1500 to 1800, or some people would say from the Renaissance to the Revolution, the French Revolution. And it's really sort of born out of this sort of old way of thinking was, okay, there's this medieval period and then there's this modern period, but then historians started to say, well, maybe there's something in between, right? There's a period in which all these major shifts happen, such as the scientific revolution, the invention of the printing press and the spread of print, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, states starting to centralize, right? The rise of absolutism, and thinking that, maybe there's some utility in viewing this period as its own thing. And so, for my purposes, right, so my book doesn't focus on this full 300-year period. It's really focused on the period after the 30 Years' War from 1648 until roughly the 1780s, 1790s. That's mostly where my source base ends. The 30 Years' War was sort of one of the kind of last wars of religion in Europe, following a kind of 100 plus year span of religious wars in the wake of the Protestant Reformation. It really devastated Europe in environmentally, in terms of population. And after the war, there was really so much devastation that there was a desire and a need to reform civic systems and consolidate civic control of public health. And so that really kind of yields increased control over childbirth. So that's why I picked that period for a study of midwives. It made sense to me. A lot of these kind of reforms happen after 1648. In terms of the Jewish communities, or what's happening with the Jewish communities at this time, they also start to form different structures than we see in the medieval period. They start to have, communal employees, parnasim, gabayim. They start to keep records of all of this, everything that happens in communities, not everything, but they start to keep, records of communal life. And they start to keep track of what's going on in a way that we just don't have for the medieval period. In terms of the sort of geography, in my book, I say it's Northern Europe, parts of Europe that experienced this war and the resultant restructuring. So that's sort of from the broad European sense, and from the more kind of Jewish perspective, these places shared, first of all, the same genre of record keeping. We see these conventions of record keeping across different communities in Northern Europe, and the same language, right? They all are Yiddish speaking communities working with the same sort of like set of assumptions with different local applications of these things. So I hope that answered a little bit about what the time period is and where I kind of draw the geographical boundaries of it.
Right, and we should also mention the Sephardic community, especially really the Spanish-Portuguese community, Amsterdam and Hamburg. Those are communities that come up, and I'm sure we'll discuss them here in this episode.
Yeah.
And you also do a great job, I think, of really laying this out in the introduction in the book, which is almost like a first chapter, because you kind of lay out the Jewish communities and communal changes and shifts as the communities start changing, and the Kehillah structure and different things that really we're not going to go into fully in depth here, but it's kind of what you just mentioned there, and how this does play a role, though, in medicine and in midwives. And if you want to just elaborate a little more, perhaps, on that, and what kind of role the kind of shifts and these new trends in these Jewish communities plays, especially as it affects midwives and medicine in the Jewish community.
Yeah, so the community, in addition to just recording a lot more information, Jewish communities across Northern Europe begin to hire communal employees who are salaried employees in Jewish communities. They hire physicians to care for the poor. They hire shochtim. They hire, a whole slew of people, tax collectors, to carry out the kind of business of the communities, different functionaries. The community makes different regulations about a host of different things. Regulations about kashrut, regulations about mikvaot, regulations about, the price of fish and how much one can charge for fish, right? Creating a kind of price ceiling. And so what begins to happen during this time, midwives are one of the kind of subset of employees who are hired by many of these Jewish communities, and one of the few communal employees who are women. But these communities control a lot of the internal business of what goes on and sort of the boundaries of Jewish life. But they also have to adhere to civic standards where they live, right? Because obviously they're not operating in a vacuum. They are living in the world, right? And they are living under municipal authorities, whether it's in Amsterdam or Hamburg or Metz or what have you. And so for me, the question is, where is this tension between, the kind of control or communal autonomy that Jewish communities have and the kind of the civic municipal control? Where do they butt heads? Where do municipal authorities and Jewish communal authorities butt heads? And how do midwives show us these rifts? So for example, I think one of the most kind of clear examples that comes through I hope comes through in the book, is that, there's a case from the 1750s in Amsterdam that is almost entirely absent from the Jewish communal records. And by the way, when I'm talking about Jewish communal records in Amsterdam, I'm working on the Ashkenazim. We'll talk about how the Sephardim fit in, I think, but those aren't the records that I'm dealing with. So the records of the Ashkenazic community in Amsterdam don't mention this case, but the records of the medical college in Amsterdam, which is under sort of municipal control, describe this instance that occurs over a number of years, where two midwives, whose names are Bella and Sercha, they are communal midwives for the poor. They're tasked with delivering children to poor women in the Ashkenazic community of Amsterdam. And within the community, they're lauded and respected. But the officers of the medical college discover that these two women are practicing without having sat for an examination or paying for licensure, in addition to not having kind of registered as apprentice midwives, et cetera, et cetera. And this was all legally required by the city of Amsterdam, right? If you want to be a midwife, you have to go through these official procedures, right? You got to pay the fee, you got to register as an apprentice, go sit for your exam, take your exam, pass it, pay for a license. And what becomes very clear through this documentation that's entirely in the medical college is that there's this sort of back and forth between the parnasim, the officers of the Jewish community, the lay leaders of the Jewish community, and the officers of the medical college, who are saying these women need to sit for this examination or, pay their license. And the parnasim are kind of pushing back against this again and again. And I think what comes through is that this licensure and examination is not something that the Jewish community cares about. But the medical college is very disturbed by this, right? As are other midwives in the city, Christian midwives, who are saying these women are taking our business and it's not fair that they're allowed to practice without going through these hoops that we had to go through to become midwives. And the medical college tries to curtail the practice of these two midwives, Sercha and Bella, by finding them repeatedly. But there's also really kind of what also comes through is that even though they keep trying to levy these fines against the Jewish community, there's very little enforcement mechanism. These women continue to practice, and it's clear that they have the approval of the Jewish community, right? This case doesn't appear in the Jewish communal records, but these women's names appear in the Jewish communal records as the communal midwives, right? So they have the support of the Jewish community. And so I think that we see, these cases show us, and this one in particular, where these standards diverge between the Jewish community and civic authorities, right? Where they may be aligned in thinking about, okay, we want safe and successful childbirth, we want good outcomes, but where these ideas of what qualifications are and what standards are really at odds.
Let's now turn to, at least to start. So, you mentioned there the midwives, and you can kind of see a little bit kind of the starting. And it's interesting to say also how they had to take exams, if you will. And some of them, I think, I don't know if it's this one or there was another story where they didn't even speak the language. So they had to have someone copy for them into like Yiddish, that they were able to read the medical textbook, if you will, so that they could prepare for, I guess, an oral examination, right?
Yeah. Well, she had to be able to read the regulations. So that's a midwife named Rosa Solomons. She actually appears in many different chapters in the book, and is unique in that we still don't know that much about her, but we know much more about her than we know about other Jewish midwives in this period, largely because she had this manuscript that has various components, one of which is these regulations translated for her from Dutch to Yiddish. From the city of Amsterdam for midwives. And so she had to prove that she could read these regulations in order to practice as a midwife. And we know from the medical college records that she could not read Dutch, right? It says she came for her exam and she couldn't read Dutch. And so they sent her away, basically. And she came back a couple of weeks later. And the medical college records describe this as that she came back with regulations in Hebrew. But we have her manuscript, which is really special, serves as this sort of missing piece of the puzzle, that she actually hired a translator to translate these regulations from Dutch into Yiddish, not to Hebrew, because she wouldn't have known Hebrew, but she did evidently read Yiddish, and so could read these regulations aloud for the officers of the medical college. So that's a woman who actually went through the channels of saying, okay, I'm going to do this examination and licensure the right way, and I'm not going to practice, until I get these regulations translated.
As we've been discussing here, as women that have training and licensure, and they're hired by the community, and we'll get more into that, what their salary was, how many midwives per person, and so on. But what about before that? Let's pull back a little bit. What at least do we know until this period, in the earlier period? What was the midwives, like, what was going on? And I don't know if we're going all the way back to medieval Europe, but like, what was at least before this time period? Do we know like what was going on
with midwives specifically?
Midwives specifically, and you talk about medicine in general amongst the Jews, but focused on midwives, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, we know that women were involved in a sort of range of healing endeavors. Um, they were involved in all kinds of domestic healing. We know that sort of the most common place where people would learn about medical care on a sort of day-to-day level was in the home. Women were operating as healers and midwives in the medieval period, but this was not necessarily a profession in the same way that we see in the early modern period. And there's some complications to that. In the early modern period, not everyone who was involved in childbirth was professional, but we don't see it sort of crystallizing into something where there's this path towards licensure examination, a full-time job, something with a salary and benefits, we might call them, that we don't see in the medieval period. We see it more as, one might say, an avocation instead of a profession. There was sort of an idea for a long time among medical historians, sort of this. The earliest medical historians were physicians themselves, who were really invested in sort of narrating the history of physicians, who were university trained, who were elite often. And then there was a generation of historians of medicine who said, well, there's some kind of social history of medicine. There's something else going on. And maybe, there were actually more connections between women who were in pursuit of quality healthcare. Maybe there were if we broaden the way that we think of healthcare and include these women who were not necessarily professionally trained or full-time practitioners, we might get a better sense of what kinds of healing roles women had in this early period. So we know that they often, even women who were not necessarily educated or trained in some formal way, would provide bandages for others, would help in the communal hospice, the hospice being where the sick poor would go. And so this was really something that women were very, very integral to. It was very widespread. We can see this in a variety of genres, in particular in Memorbucher, which I think we'll talk about in a little bit. But these kind of memorial books, right, Yizkor books, where people, give tzedakah on behalf of someone who died, obviously, and they mention the charitable things that someone did. We often see the kind of medical or healthcare contributions of women listed among their many charitable works. And so, I mean, this is something that goes far back. I think the distinction here in this period is that we start to see a new, I wouldn't call it necessarily a class, but a layer of women who are pursuing this as a day-to-day activity that is their income. They are middle class. This is their employment, and they are salaried, employees of the community.
How does this compare to non-Jewish midwives in the same place that you're talking about in the time periods? Again, the earlier time periods and the shift towards, the early modern period that we've been talking about.
Yeah. So, I mean, for the areas that I study, the comparisons are Christian, right? Not Muslim women, but Christian midwives in the medieval period have many of the same, they look mostly the same in terms of what kinds of activities they participated in. They, again, weren't necessarily professional midwives. They were women who were kind of called upon to assist in birth. And so there is something, I think, specific about this period where the Jewish community starts to regulate all these employees, because that really starts to create it kind of throws into focus what is different about the Jewish community or Jewish midwives than Christian midwives. So Christian midwives, right? So in medieval Europe, they're ministering to different people. They're not under the auspices of one kind of communal authority. But in early modern Europe, right? So a couple hundred years or 300 years later, it depends when we're dating our medieval period too. But Christian midwives, are often employed by the city, right? The city itself. So for example, in Amsterdam, I ended up working a lot on Amsterdam for this book. Amsterdam employs midwives there's a class of what's called ordinary midwives, and then there's this sort of special class of midwives who are intended to care for the poor, and that is civically run. That is across the whole city. But because the Jewish community takes care of this on its own, Jewish midwives have a role within this sort of communal structure that we don't see Christian midwives having. And so they are negotiating the salary from the community. They are participating in sort of Jewish birth rituals that come across through various sources. And they are negotiating these communal questions that emerge in particular Jewish contexts. So we see them not even just communal questions. We see them negotiating halachic questions around nida and pregnancy-related concerns. We see them around issues of paternity, and that's something that we see with Christian midwives too. But I think that the halachic component of this really throws Jewish midwives into a different space than Christian midwives, because they are, whenever they're giving information to the community or to rabbis, there's this halachic component that they're dealing with. So whether it's nida or whether it's questions of inheritance and paternity, there's a different angle to their practice that Christian midwives don't necessarily have.
Yeah, and that's something that's discussed in the book. There are various examples where you looked at child teshuvos and you looked at questions where you see them in these teshuvos when the shaila comes to the Rav, and somehow the midwife is there because she plays such an integral role.
Yeah, or in court cases, right, where in the Beit Din, right? So a lot of these communities had a Beit Din or Beis Din, right? So they, if a woman comes and says, right, I became pregnant and this person is the father, he owes me money, right, for the care of this child, often a midwife will enter the kind of court dossier as someone who is trying to inspect the woman, see if she's pregnant, right, determine when this happened, see if her story kind of holds water. We see, the existence of that among Christian midwives, but not in this sort of not in the same halachic kind of format that we often see in Jewish communities.
Yeah, I think that's important to point out and to specify. There's no OBGYN in these days. So
right.
As you say, when they're coming to Beis Din, is the woman pregnant? What's going on? There's a midwife there. She's the one who's called in. She's the one who's present.
Right.
Let's go back to another thing that you mentioned, which is the midwives. They become these communal employees, and they're paid a salary. What kind of salary are we talking about? How many midwives does Amsterdam is a big community. Does a place like Amsterdam have, or Hamburg? How many midwives per person in the Jewish community? Are they also servicing non-Jews? What's going on? Talk more about them and their role in this time period.
Okay, so tell me if I don't answer all the things you asked and follow.
Sorry, I threw them all into one.
No, it's good. It's good. So, okay, so who paid the salary or what were they paid? There are different models we see across. I looked at a wide range of Pinkasei Kihila, so communal records. So we see a range of different models. We see them being paid monthly. We see them being paid annually, sometimes weekly. Sometimes they're given money, and then they're also given chezkat kihila, so like a communal standing, right? That gives them certain benefits. Sometimes they're given firewood, aka heat. Occasionally they're given grain. Some midwives are appointed on a multi-year contract that's paid out in sort of quarterly installments. There are all kinds of different arrangements that we can detect across these different pinkasim. we have some numbers of what different midwives made. So a midwife from Frankfurt in the 17th century, she got an annual salary of 6 Reichsthaler. But those in addition to payment, like an additional payment for each individual client and also free housing. But it's different. It's difficult to figure out like what these currencies on their own mean, and especially difficult to compare across locations, right? There's these varying currencies, right? The currency in Altona is a shilling, the currency in Frankfurt is a florin, the currency in Amsterdam is gulden. So it's hard to compare across locations because of these currencies, but we know that generally speaking, salaries went up over time. So for example, we see them getting a yearly raise. But often these women, the best way that I found to compare salaries is to look at the sort of the salaries of different functionaries within a community to see where midwives fall. So for example, the physician of the Ashkenazi community in Amsterdam gets 275 zehuvim. And then the junior physicians get half that amount. And then the shochet of the community around the same time gets 120 zehuvim. The midwives, as opposed to the physicians where the elder physician gets double the amount of the junior physicians, they all get the same thing, but that salary is much less. It's 40 zehuvim, right? So it's a lower salary, but it's consistent for all the midwives. They all get the same thing. We have some evidence that midwives, both Jewish and Christian, would supplement these salaries by taking on some paying clients, right? So sort of like freelancing, I guess we could think of it as. In terms of how many people are covered by one midwife, it's hard to know because of the records that we have are not fully comprehensive for one midwife, right? So we have these records from individual midwives who recorded their deliveries, but we don't know if they included every single birth they ever attended. In fact, they most probably did not include every single one. So it's hard to say how many people were covered by one midwife. A large community like Amsterdam had 4 midwives to care for the poor, right? That was just the people who could not necessarily afford to hire their own midwives. I would say every sizable Jewish community in Europe had at least one midwife. I don't know if we have the numbers for Hamburg, how many. For rural communities, the picture was different. So for example, this actually isn't in the book, so this is only for listeners, not actually something that made its way into the book. But I came across a set of documents from Metz several years ago that was about a rural area. I at first thought this set of documents was from Metz itself, but it was actually from a little town 10 or so kilometers outside of Metz. That was a rural area that, with a small Jewish community that did not have its own midwife because there just was not a Jewish midwife in the area. And the documents were petitioning the Parliament of Metz to allow Catholic midwives who were in this little rural area to serve Jewish women. Because for the Jewish midwives to come from Metz, it was dangerous, it was long, she's too far away, right? Labor is like not predictable in terms of how long it's going to take. And so the picture looks very different, I think, for rural and urban communities. But we also know that from this kind of documentation, that there are instances of Christian midwives serving Jews, and there is at least some kind of openness to it, depending on who we're talking about. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, because that's something else that we haven't discussed. Is people might be, listening and wondering, but wait, why were there only Jewish midwives? Why not have the non-Jewish, a Catholic, or not Catholic, a Christian, I should say, take the back, a Christian midwife, servicing Jews?
Yeah. So, it seems like this is something that from the Jewish perspective, there wasn't necessarily a problem with. I didn't look at Christian midwives registers to see if Jewish names come up, but we definitely know that Jewish midwives served Christian women, and it again always depends on where we're talking about, right? So, in France, which is mostly the area I was just talking about is mostly Catholic, right? The picture looks very different than somewhere like the Netherlands, which might be much more open to Jewish Christian interaction in general and in the realm of childbirth specifically, because it's first of all not it's Calvinist. At least Amsterdam is Calvinist at the time, and birth is not under the sort of dominion of the church. There's just a different posture towards these kinds of interactions, and so this midwife from Amsterdam, this Rosa Solomons, whose manuscript I talked about earlier, she has several non-Jewish names of people who are clearly not Jewish in her register of births. One who she even calls Unser Shabbos-Goya. So our Shabbos-Goy. This is like my favorite entry in her register, because it's not only, someone who's not Jewish, but someone who is not Jewish and is very dear to her clearly, right? Works in her household as her Shabbos-Goy. And so we know that these things happen. We also have a midwife from the northern Netherlands who we have her register, and her name is also Rosa, different Rosa. She describes that she has an introduction to her register, and she says, this is the book that I, wrote all the names of all the Jewish children who I delivered in this town. And I also have a whole book of non-Jewish children that I delivered, but that's in a separate book, right? And that's written in Dutch. Now, I don't know where that manuscript went. I've never seen it. I hope someone finds it one day. Now this book is out, maybe someone will uncover it. But right, that really, I think, speaks to the level of interaction that these people had, right? That there is this woman who has this register for deliveries to Jews and deliveries to non-Jews, that there's a lot of interaction. But again, it's very dependent on where we're talking about and sort of what the communal control is over birth, and who these midwives are, right? Are they the communal employees who are only charged with caring for members of the Jewish community, or are they these sort of like freelance midwives who have their own practices?
I think we should talk a little bit about sources. And usually in these, many episodes, I wait till the end. Sources is like the nerdy, geeky thing. Why are we talking about sources? But sources here is important because you already mentioned their ledger, their Pinkas, and other sources that perhaps you may have used.
I'm jumping ahead of,
No, and not a problem. And I did an episode years ago already with Professor Elisheva Kalbach about Pinkasim in general, and then I just did recently the episode with Professor Kalbach and Professor Kaplan about their book, which came up. But, when you talk about a midwife having her own Pinkas, what do we mean, and what other sources did you use?
Yeah, so I mentioned before I used a lot of these communal Pinkasim, right? These communal registers that are held by the community. They're actually often kept under lock and key in the community and recording like the business of the community. When we talk about midwives' own Pinkasim, their own records, they look. I worked with only 3, right? That's the sample size that I could find, which I feel like is a lot actually for given this subject and the time period. But I'm sure again someone's going to uncover another one now that this is out, and I hope to see it. So I worked with 3 midwives Pinkasim, their own registers of deliveries. One from Hamburg, or really from Altona. One from Amsterdam, and one from Groningen, which is in the northern Netherlands. The one that this midwife recorded, that she had another register that she kept for non-Jewish children. The Hamburg Pinkas appears to me to be more like a communal register in that it's not really attributable to any one midwife. It has a cover page that says like, Entbindungsregister. So it's a delivery register. It looks very formal. It states the dates. So it looks like it was not necessarily edited, but sort of refined for some kind of like communal preservation. And also we can see that there are births that are added in after the date, right? They say like these births were forgotten and added in later. So there's some kind of effort at comprehensiveness that I don't see in the other two registers that are attributed to individuals. And that one is from, I'm forgetting exact dates, the Hamburg one, but it's like the 1770s to 1790s, I want to say. And the Groningen one, this one from the northern Netherlands, is from begins in 1793, so it's the latest of them. And that one looks more like a regional practice, right? Groningen is a small city, it's a town. And so this midwife is going, there's people mentioned from other places. She's probably traveling a bit more, not super far, but from place to place. The Amsterdam Register, which is the earliest, but I saved it for last to mention it because it is, I think, unique in the sense that it exists in this larger manuscript, right? So this larger manuscript that has these regulations from the city of Amsterdam that we talked about earlier that are translated. It has a treatise translated from Dutch to Yiddish for midwives, so a sort of midwifery handbook that this woman could potentially read, and that it has these delivery records. So unlike the other two, which are, I think, more maybe fall into the genre of Pinkasim in that they are registers, they're notebooks, there's not anything else contained in them other than these records. This manuscript of Rosa Solomon's has a lot more in it other than just the records. So, the working with this translated treatise into Yiddish also led me into working with other midwifery handbooks in Dutch, in French, in German. I also used, I mentioned this earlier, Memorbucher, these Yizker books. So that's another genre of communal record. I wouldn't call it a communal pinkas in the same way, but it's these entries of people donating money, to remember their loved ones, that also happen to have a lot of entries for women who participate in childbirth in various ways. I used Memorbucher from Metz, from Frankfurt, from Mainz. There might be one I'm forgetting, Worms, I think. And then there is a chapter of the book that is really focused on rabbinic writings, in particular Shutim, Sheilot or Tshuvot, that really crisscrosses in terms of its geography because these were letters that were being sent all around. So I focused mostly on these printed Shutim that I came, that this is actually how the project started. I started finding these instances of questions about Nida that these rabbis writing about it often asked, they mention in passing that they asked the midwife, right, like the Mialedet, and Nashim, the Nashim Pichot, right, the wise women, sometimes they're called other things. And then I said, that's really interesting. They're referencing these women. So I started looking at a lot of these rabbinic sources, about, to see what I could find on that. So that's the main kind of spread. There's also a whole bunch of notarial records, which I forgot, which is, those are, really about, paternity attestations, right? It's women who are coming to say, like, this person is the father of my child, and I want to get payment for usually that's what they want. They want the presumed father to pay for the child, pay the midwife. And so that's a whole kind of genre of records. It's one chapter of the book as well.
So most of these Pinkasim, it's the midwives just writing down that, so-and-so gave birth to a son, gave birth to a daughter. Like, they're just writing things, take that down just for, like, facts. What kind of information were you able to discover or come across from Pinkasim that you may not have come across otherwise?
Yeah. So I mean, they're very interesting because they're often very formulaic. And so you have to almost make a spreadsheet of them in order to figure out what's different about one entry over another. So we see, first of all, we can detect, I already mentioned these people who are not necessarily part of the Jewish community who midwives are delivering, right? People who are clearly not Jewish. We see that there are women who are unattached, single women, not married, who are delivering children. Sometimes they are expressly stated as unmarried. Sometimes it's just, the name of a woman when the rest of the Pinkas, the rest of the register only has the father's name, the man's name, or the father of the woman giving birth who's paying the midwife. And so it's sort of a clue when it just mentions, Sheinche or Breinle or someone who's just the name of a woman, that usually that's someone who was a single woman. And so those are people who we don't see much elsewhere. One of the most interesting things that I came across in this Hamburg register, this Hamburg delivery register, is that we have a number of entries of children who then it says that the child was born to so-and-so, and then it said, excuse me, angegeben an so-and-so. So it says the child was given to someone else. And so I was sort of able through that to uncover not necessarily a system, because we can't say a lot about how the system worked through that, but some kind of system, for lack of a better word, of adoption or foster care, that some of these children are being given to other people. That's something that, we really don't have a ton of other records for. We see that there were, this is primarily in Amsterdam, although also in Hamburg, that there were interactions between Sephardim and Ashkenazim that we often go undetected. Ashkenazic midwives delivered children of Sephardic women regularly. We see a lot of common names of converso families, prominent converso families that appear in these registers: Cardozo, Pinto, a lot of these. So those are some of the things that we see. We don't get a lot of information about the midwives themselves. The one exception to that is that Rosa Solomons in Amsterdam, the first entry in her in the delivery register portion of her manuscript is that she writes, it's the only one that's a personal milestone. She writes that, the date, this is the date in 1708 when I registered myself in the medical college. And so that is, again, something that when I saw that, I went to the medical college records to see, well, can I find her on that actual date? And it actually lines up with what she writes in her register, which is, I think, very sweet.
Now, how about compared to Pinkasim of Moyalim? So, this is something that I don't think I've ever discussed this on the podcast, but many Moyalim they kept a Pinkas. Notably, the Chassam Sofer had one, the Rabbach, Rabbi Korn Vitali from Italy. There's some famous rabbinic ones because many Rabbanim were Moyalim and they would keep a Pinkas. So, how do these compare, if there's any comparison?
Yeah. So first of all, there are so many more Pinkasei Moel. Like, there are just tons and tons of them. It would, in some ways, even though I said, I am working with 3, it's a small sample size. It's not able to say anything super representative. It's a little bit of a gift, because if I could never write about the whole genre of Pinkasei of Mohel, because there's just so many. But yeah, I think. And I can't say midwives were completely, using the format that Moalim were using. But I think that there's some sort of connection between these genres, right? They're recording, one's recording, not births, but brisim, and recording, essentially like half the population, let's say, that's born. And the other one is recording, boys and girls in this register. And so there's sort of, I mean, what I argued about midwives registers, which I think is also true in some way about those kept by Moalim, is that they're sort of early vital records, right? This is a time period where Jewish communities are not keeping like a census or kind of any kind of official birth records. They don't, at least in the first half of the 18th century, they don't have to submit any kind of birth records to civic authorities. That's not required until the later part of the 18th century at the very earliest in some places. And so this is the records that we have of people who are born in various communities. And so, I mean, nowadays, a lot of people have used them for genealogy, right, in terms of like figuring out who their families were, but by these records. But they're sort of early thinking about how to record this kind of information that's not necessarily, here's what happened in the community, or here's what the kahal decided, or here's this, event that happened, a fight in the street that happened between these two parties, but it's a different kind of record that starts to be produced. And we see the format shifting, I think, over the 18th century, where both midwives and Moalim are trying to figure out how to encode this information. And, again, my small sample size, I can't say, there's definitely like an evolution over these three manuscripts, but we do see it looking much more kind of standardized or formulaic by the end of the 18th century compared to the beginning, when we're sort of seeing people trying to figure out what kind of information needs to be written down.
Rabbinic sources, we've mentioned Shalos V'Tshuvas, so, but you've to name a few, Yeshelis Yavitz, Avodas HaGershuni, Adnei Paz, you have all sorts of different Shalos V'Tshuvas. So this time period, I don't know if you want to mention an example or two that comes to mind, because you already mentioned, different ones that you used before, but if there's some interesting examples or stories that you want to mention.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the things that, this is where I get into my medical stuff, real medical stuff. So one of the things that comes across a lot in some of these, one of the common questions is a question about, right, whether something is a postpartum complication or falls into the realm of nida. And so we see this a lot. We see this question of whether something called uterine prolapse, right, which is a postpartum condition where the uterus slips down as a result of weakened muscles after childbirth. This question of whether this sort of bleeding that results from this falls into nida or falls under nida. And there's, I think of, a very interesting, responsum by, it's Shud Zichron Yosef, which is Yosef Steinhardt. And he is late 18th century. And he's trying to figure out, right, whether this is a problem, whether this is like me'akev tvila, like, can this woman go into the mikvah if she has this issue? The kind of, there's a common remedy for it. Does this kind of create a barrier for bidika? And, what he sort of discovers, or what I discovered rather, maybe he knew this, but, is that there's this whole network of women who seem to know how women are dealing with this problem and how they're getting around the halachic issues, right? And saying, oh no, like they use this one thing to kind of like hold their ligaments in place, for, the first half of the month, and then they switch it for the second half of the month to a different one. And then they take it out during Tvila and it's not a problem. It's not ma'akev. So, he's asking this woman, right? He says, Sha'alti et nashim hamimunot. So he says, I asked the appointed women. Now, we don't know if they're communally appointed or appointed, if he just means like they're these women who are designated that there are other women who ask questions to. But they seem to clearly know how women are practicing nida. And so I think that we can see that there's sort of this network of women who are very medically savvy, first of all, but they understand enough about nida to be able to tell the rabbi right, who's writing this tshuva, no, this isn't a problem, right? This isn't a halachic problem. Now, there are complications to that, right? There are instances where, we have examples of, similar cases where a midwife or a wise woman, nashim pikchot or nashim chachamot, tell someone, it's okay to go to the mikvah. And then, she then asks the rabbi, and he's upset that, a woman, gave a halachic ruling as opposed to just making the sort of medical diagnosis. But I think in large part, we can see that these, expert women, we can call them, serve as these sort of interlocutors with rabbis, about these halachic questions, particularly around women's bodies and their functions. And really, I mean, they appear in other kinds of questions, but the most prominent category is in Nida, questions. So again, I mean, that was really where this project started from, and continues to fascinate me. There's all kinds of different questions. And I think that, I've always resisted, throughout writing this, I've resisted calling them any kind of like pre-modern yoatzot halacha. But I mean, in some ways, their function is similar to what we might think of, right? It's not like this is the source for that. I wouldn't presume to say that. But if you want to think of a kind of like analog, it could be similar.
And then, as you said before, you find the midwives in the court cases, and you find them as, for those purposes, and we find them in use at a member booker, and you find them in various different source places showing up. Another thing that you focus on, and we mentioned it before, this Rosa Solomons and her book, this Sefer HaNashim, she kind of translates and kind of a copyist writes it out as in a manuscript, and actually it says, there's a picture in the book of the title page, and it says Hami Aledes, Rosa Hami Aledes, I think, Sefer HaNashim, and you kind of really discuss that and books in general and how they incorporated books and those type of things into their midwifery, is it?
Yeah. Midwifery, because it used to, in early English, it didn't have it wasn't F-E-R-Y, it was just midwife '-R-Y, so that's midwifery, not midwifery. Cocktail party trick for everybody. So, that was a really interesting component of this, because we don't know, there's no notes in the margins, so we can't say exactly how she read this. So I took the kind of approach of saying, well, what do we think this book could have meant to her as a midwife? Since we can't exactly say, like, here's what she wrote down about it, or here's her notes, her practice notes. But this Sefer HaNashim was translated from a Dutch midwifery handbook that as I said before, and it's a very small handbook, the original. It's like, I have a picture somewhere of it next to my hand, and it's not much bigger than my hand. So for reference, I have small-ish hands. And so this was probably something that midwives maybe would carry around. And so we know from this medical college records that she couldn't read Dutch. And so she probably wanted to know what this was saying, right? And to have it translated for her into Yiddish, which was the language that she could read. And actually the title page, so she commissions a translator to translate this text for her. And the title page of it says, the translator writes that she has let it be transcribed, let it be translated, so that she will not need any other midwives, right? Now, we could look at this as like, oh, this is just like boilerplate language that she says, he's saying, oh, now she can do everything on her own. But maybe she wanted to have this book as a sort of credential of something that she could refer to. The original book, the Dutch book, has a lot of illustrations, or these kind of what other scholars have called birth figures, right? Presentations of how the baby could be positioned in the uterus, different instruments, all these kinds of different things. And so I think, again, without saying this is definitely how she used it, that this was something that she would use, that she would take the original together with her manuscript, that maybe the manuscript was she would actually read for the text, but that this original, the printed book, in Dutch was something that she could show her clients these different presentations. And it also would make her look very erudite, right? It would make her look like she was really qualified. This is a time when, midwifery is still something that at that time was very much apprentice driven. People learned from their mother or mother-in-law or signed up with another, midwife to be their apprentice. But it's also a time when book learning is on the rise. And so having a book as a kind of status symbol or a credential, and I don't mean that in a sort of cynical way, but something that really like carried some kind of meaning, and it made her look and feel more professional, was something that people were interested in. And so having this to be able to, maybe show clients, who are experiencing different parts of labor and childbirth, different positionings of their fetuses, would be something she would be interested in. It also contains a number of prescriptions, that are actually not translated into Yiddish. They're kept in Latin in the manuscript, the Yiddish translation. So, perhaps she would take these kinds of prescriptions to an apothecary to help patients, right? And that kind of the language in which that would have taken place would be in Latin. So you wouldn't want to translate these into Yiddish, if you were going to maybe give this prescription to the apothecary. So those are some of the things that kind of, come up in thinking about the way that, this woman, used this book.
An apothecary being like a pharmacy or
like
a
pharmacist. Yeah. The early modern name for like what we would call a pharmacist. Yeah.
Exactly. So in your book, the second appendix, you have two small appendices. The second appendix is recipes in Sefer Nashim. And you left it in Latin also, didn't translate it. So my Latin isn't very good. Probably most listeners are like, well, what is this? So these are recipes. You just decided to include them in the book?
Yeah, I mean, they're the recipes from the original text. And I thought, that was really for my history of science junkies who are interested in recipes and like what kind of knowledge transfers between languages, between cultures, to just preserve those for anyone who's sort of like interested in seeing what kinds of remedies would be used for any kind of, some of them are childhood ailments. Some of them are kind of labor, inducing remedies, anti-nausea things, all kinds of a real kind of gamut of things. But I just wanted to reproduce that for people to be able to, use it if they want to compare different kinds of handbooks and what they contain.
So just in closing, how would you say, for yourself certainly, but for everyone here to read the book or listening to this, how does this inform or help our and further our understanding of midwifery and midwives and childbirth and medicine and all that in this time period?
Yeah, so first of all, these women were, tasked with a variety of things, right? They had to record births. They often had to testify about the paternity of infants. They're treating women who are about to give birth or have just given birth. And so they really serve as Jewish communal functionaries in a way that we don't see other women doing during this period. And because of this unique role that they have, they encounter both institutions and authorities, both within the Jewish community and outside of it, on a very regular basis. And they begin to shape these sort of institutions and find ways to negotiate these different spaces and use them for their own needs. Rosa is one example of saying, okay, well, she's going to the medical college, but then she's going to like get this translation, right? Translate the regulations, for her own needs, and then go back to the medical college with this translation, right? And then continue her practice. And so one of the claims that I try to make in this book is that midwives like her, are important for understanding how Jews more broadly, navigated these sort of multi-confessional, or what that's what historians would call it, but multi-religious landscapes and sort of different institutions that start to emerge in the early modern period. We see Jewish midwives constantly writing themselves into the records. They act as extensions of communal authority in some cases. Sometimes they're kind of parts of these burgeoning medical bureaucracies, right? I try to track like the way that these medical bureaucracies are emerging and the way that women become part of them. And they become, consultants on halachic issues, as I said before. And so the midwives really become central to the development of a Jewish communal politics and urban healthcare provision, as well as religious ritual, which we didn't really discuss tonight, but and recording these sort of vital records in the early modern period. And so that's what I try to really do in this book, to think about the way in which these women encountered, Jewish communal authorities and institutions, and what that can tell us more broadly about how Jews were shaped by these changes and shaped their lives around these changes.
Okay, well, thank you for joining me to discuss this. I'll link the book in the show notes. I should mention, so there's a hardcover and a paperback. Definitely buy the paperback. The paperback is very affordable at $30, really, for an academic book, brand new. Right away, there's a paperback. So that's available from Stanford University Press directly. It's available via Amazon. And so I'll link to that in the show's notes for those interested in purchasing it. And thank you, Professor Katz, for joining me.
Thank you.